Chapter 35 introduces really just some special uses for the dative case. And so there's nothing really new. And like I've been saying with some of these other chapters, is we're kind of done with grammatical forms, memorizing a bunch of charts or the way things change and things like that. We're really just kind of rounding out and filling out the last edges and corners of our understanding of Latin grammar. Right? There's only five more chapters to go, and so this is an example of one of those chapters. We have some uses for the dative that are a little bit different than what you would generally expect, and so it's really just important to recognize them in translations. It's not really an issue of having to memorize a bunch of things. It's really just you're going to see datives in sentences, and sometimes that dative may not be translated specifically as you would expect a dative to be translated in its like normal pure sense. And that's really just where it's important. It's to sort of be aware of these things, and so it's like introducing a topic that you need to be aware of as we're moving forward. And so there's three of those, and we're going to talk about them. There's datives when they're used with adjectives. There's datives with special verbs, so just different, in particular verbs. And there's datives with what I say compounds, but datives that are compound verbs, and we'll talk about what those are. You've seen them before, but it's really just another kind of special use with datives. Okay, but getting into it and just talking about the dative case without getting maybe trying not to get too complicated here. Remember, in the most basic sense, the dative case is used for indirect objects. So, an example like I'm giving the book to you, right? Giving is the verb. What's being given the book? So that's your direct object. But I'm receiving, or you are receiving the book, and so it's sort of like once removed, and that's your indirect object. And if you really wanted to like expand this out, it would be something like this. I'm giving the book. I'm giving this direct object, and I'm not just giving it to anyone, but I'm specifically giving it to you or in your direction towards you. And that's kind of a helpful way to look at it for the things that we're going to be talking about with these other uses, because they all kind of go back to this. And the way that I'm going to phrase it is that there are a few other particular verb constructions that use datives, but they all have this basic sense of reference or direction towards someone or something that you see in the dative already, right? So it's nothing kind of new. It's just there's going to be times where, hey, maybe the dative is replacing this other case, but it makes sense in the context of, you know, like I'm giving the book not just to you, but specifically in the direction of you or in reference to you is where this book's going. And that's kind of the idea. Like I said before, mainly these are helpful to know when translating, like just being aware that they exist so that when you see a dative, again, you can sort of go through, is it a basic use of a dative? Is it a dative with a compound verb? Is it a dative used with an adjective? Whatever it is, right? So again, don't be, I know this is kind of, grammar speak right now, but that's basically all that this is they all the idea is that they don't in any way sort of like buck the trend that you would expect with datives are showing reference to particular things or objects, and these special uses are going to be doing that same thing. Okay, so starting with datives with adjectives. Okay, and we've seen this, it just hasn't been formally introduced yet. So we've seen this before where it's like, hey, remember we've seen this thing before? Well, here's what it actually is really called. So the idea is that many adjectives, especially if they're showing like an attitude or a quality or a relationship between things, with those adjectives, a noun is going to be used in the dative to indicate the direction in which that adjective applies, or where is that being pointed towards. Okay, and it's an easy way to recognize them in English is that these adjectives are normally followed by to, towards, or for in English. Okay, so think of things like loyal to. That's one. I'm loyal to you. or this person is dear to me. That's what we're trying to get at, is there are adjectives like dear and loyal that even in English would express this idea of a dative, or it's, you have to be pointing, you're loyal to what, right? And so Latin has that same thing. And so here are just a few examples of that. Like sciebamos te mihi fidelem esse, right? I know, sciebamos, you were loyal to me. And literally it says, I know, you to be loyal to me. It's an indirect statement. But instead of saying, there's no other really way to phrase it. It's just, hey, you see a dative, and it makes sense. In this, where it's not really a special use. It's just, hey, some adjectives use datives. Same thing here. Quisque sibi caris est. Each person is dear to himself, to or for himself, right? And that's just, it makes sense as far as the translation goes. So words like faithful, loyal, uh, dear, those ones are ones that you're going to see, and it's really just, hey, it's datives with an adjective. Um, there's nothing new there. We've seen these before. There's nothing really new there. This is even, we've seen this with passive periphrastics. Like, it is necessary for me to do something, right? And then that for me is in the dative. Nothing new there, right? So just datives with adjectives. Be aware of them. Be aware that they exist. Make sure you get these notes down. The next one is datives with special verbs. And again, something where it's just, hey, you kind of need to be aware of it. Okay, so like with those adjectives, if some verbs indicate attitude or a relationship, and they'll use a noun in the dative as their direct object instead of an accusative. All right, so typically we would say, you know, I love you, and that you would be in the accusative. But there are certain verbs that are going to indicate, attitude or relationship. They're going to use a dative instead of an accusative, and it makes sense when you see them, because again, most of them will have some of the characteristics we just saw. Okay, so again, you should kind of just recognize the most common ones that use this construction. There are a lot in this chapter, and you can see a couple other ones as we keep going. But for each of these verbs in their definition, you'll see that the word to is at the end. It'll be to something to, right? Or, blank to, something like that. And it implies some kind of attitude, or it's automatically pointing in the direction towards a person or a thing, right? So just like we saw before with datives with adjectives, someone's dear to someone, right? Dear in relation to something or someone. The same thing with these verbs. It's going to be this verb is in relation towards, or some kind of feeling or emotion towards some person, and there's going to be the word to. So again, kind of easy to recognize, but here are some examples of those verbs. Like we have credo. So credo means to entrust or to believe or entrust something to someone, right? And so something like credo tibi, I believe you. Literally, it's, I entrust to you, right? Or I am trusting in direction to you, right? And so instead of saying credo te, I trust you, it's credo tibi. It just takes the dative. Same thing, we have impero, which is to give orders to someone, or to command them. So impero militibus, in the dative there, I command the soldiers, or I give orders to, in the direction of, towards the soldiers. And then we have nokeo, to harm, same thing. Nokeo hostibus, I harm the enemies, or I do harm to or towards the enemy, right? So attitude maybe is like a bad word there, right? These are all saying, I trust, it's a feeling maybe, I command, I want you to do something. I'm doing harm to you. That might be a little bit, you're thinking meanly of someone. Parco, plus a dative, to be lenient to someone, or sparing in the direction of someone else. So parco vobis, I spare you, right? So it's just using those datives, and then with placio, pleasing, to please. And so you could be like, I am pleasing to my father, or that you please them, because you're, good boys and girls, whatever. So again, this is really just recognizing that you're going to see datives in all of, with these special verbs, and that you might want to translate it some way, and you're like, wait, this doesn't make sense. It's not an accusative, and it's, hey, it's a dative with a special verb. And then it's like, oh, okay. And then you translate it as if it was the direct object. And really, that's kind of all there is to it. So uh, keep going. Dative with compound verbs. And this is going to be, again, a very similar thing where you're going to have a dative instead of an accusative. It's really all that there is. Okay. But certain verbs, they'll use datives instead of accusative when they're compounded with various, really, prepositions, um, but added in front as prefixes. So ad, ante, con, or cum, in, inter, ob, post, pri, pro, sub, super, cercum, or and re. And cercum and re are kind of sometimes things, but you're going to see these where that's going to be, you have a basic verb form and you put this in front of it. We've seen this before a ton of times. Um, Really, when the datives are used, is when the compound verb has a significantly different meaning than the basic verb, right? So if the verb kind of means the same thing, like we had servo and conservo, and they basically mean the same thing, that really doesn't merit a dative, right? It would be if like servo meant to save, and then conservo meant, I don't even know, to love or something like that. That would be different, right? But if they have inherently the same meaning, this isn't going to be the case. It's when that compound verb form has a significantly different meaning than what the basic verb is, and we'll see that with the examples on the next slide. And really, again, I'm trying to stress this a bunch. It's really important to just understand the concept instead of memorizing all of the compound verbs or memorizing all of the special verbs, just so that when you see a dative, you can kind of piece out what use is intended in that particular sentence, right? So it's just kind of being aware of these things and then going from there and making sure that you are just aware of all of these different, uses. It's like the different uses of the ablative again, right? Depends on the sentence, depends on the context. Same thing with these datives. Now, here are some examples. Okay, so if we said eum sequor, I follow him, like eum, that's accusative, that's fine, right? But if we said obsequor, like the word obsequious in English, means to obey. So to follow and obey, you can see they're kind of related, but it's like if you're just following someone, like literally it just means to follow in a line. Obey means, it is following directions, but kind of a different meaning. And so instead of it being, eum, it's ae, it's dative. And literally that means I follow in the direction of him, or towards, because of him, in reference to him. And so that's where you're going to see it. In some ways, you can think of it as like that uh, compound prefix is kind of like, hey, that needs a dative, and that's why we use it. Just like you see some prepositions take datives, if you want to think of it that way, but that kind of gets confusing because sometimes the thing doesn't actually use a dative in its pure sense. So looking next one, sum amicus eius, I am his friend. Sum, and then amicus, and then eius, genitive. That's fine, right? But if we said instead of sum, we made it ad sum, like amico ad sum. Sum means to be, but ad sum means to support or to stand next to be next to in a supporting way. Kind of a different meaning, right? And so I support my friend, or literally, I am next to my friend. I am standing next to them. A little bit different, and so it merits changing it to a dative. Um, this last one here, ad nos venit, he came to us, and then ad nos advenit, he came to us. There's really no change in the meaning there, and so you see a we don't need a dative, right? It can just stay in that same form. Really, the only difference between venio and advenio is just that stronger sense, like when we had servo and conservo, and that's kind of it. Um, Again, the most important thing is not necessarily, I'm not going to ask you to write these out and to actually use them actively, like translate this from English into Latin. It's to recognize them in sentences when you see them. All of these different uses. So datives with adjectives, datives with special verbs, and then datives with compound verbs is really just to recognize them and to say ad sum. Okay, well there's sum and then ad. Oh, that's a compound verb. It's a dative with a compound. And then you're translating amico, not in that literal sense of to or for my friend, but just my friend, and I support my friend. And that's really the biggest thing, is just recognizing in your sentences what type of data is being used or why a data is being used. And these are sort of the big three as far as how datives are employed outside of the basic sense of a regular old indirect object. Okay. So going forward into sentences and translations, just be aware. Be aware of these. Make sure you have these written down. And it's just another thing to kind of store away in your infinite wisdom that we are gaining for Latin.